Over the skies of occupied France, March 15, 1944, a B-17 Flying Fortress limped through the pre-dawn darkness at 12,000 feet. Inside, 8 exhausted crewmen believed they had perhaps 30 minutes before their damaged aircraft would fall from the sky. They had no idea that their survival would depend on a sketch drawn 6 months earlier by a teenage girl in Iowa, whose teachers had dismissed her project as impractical daydreaming. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a dismissed idea from a high school student, labeled as useless fantasy by everyone who saw it, would prove to be the difference between 8 men coming home and 8 families receiving telegrams they would never forget. Lieutenant Robert Mitchell had been flying bombers for 18 months, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. The No. 3 engine was completely gone, torn away by flak over the target. The No. 4 engine sputtered irregularly, losing power with each passing minute. Navigator Thomas Peterson called out their position with increasing urgency, his voice tight with the knowledge that they were losing altitude at nearly 200 feet per minute. Radio operator James Sullivan had already sent their final transmission, a simple acknowledgement that they were going down. Bombardier David Chen sat in silence, calculating odds he did not want to share with anyone. They had survived the mission over the industrial complex near Reims. 23 aircraft had gone in, and 19 had come back out. Mitchell's crew had been among the lucky ones, or so they thought, until the second wave of defensive fire caught them during the turn for home. Now, as the French countryside passed beneath them in the darkness, their luck seemed to have run out entirely. Co-pilot William Harrison studied the instruments with the methodical precision of a man who refused to accept the inevitable. Every gauge told the same story: fuel pressure dropping, oil temperature rising, hydraulic pressure fluctuating. They were dying by degrees, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Then Mitchell remembered something he had seen in a briefing room 3 weeks earlier: a diagram, a strange, impractical diagram that the intelligence officer had showed them with an almost apologetic shrug. Most of the crews had laughed. Some had rolled their eyes. Mitchell had studied it for perhaps 30 seconds before moving on to more pressing concerns. Now, in the darkness over France, that diagram was the only thing standing between his crew and a very long walk through enemy territory. The idea had come from Sarah Catherine Morrison, a 17-year-old junior at Cedar Rapids High School in Iowa. Sarah was the daughter of a factory worker and a part-time librarian, and she had never been anywhere near a military installation or an aircraft factory. Her entire knowledge of aviation came from newsreels, magazine articles, and an obsessive attention to every technical detail she could find about the war effort. Her teachers considered her bright but unfocused. Her classmates thought she was odd. Her parents worried that she spent too much time alone with her sketches and calculations. In September of 1943, Sarah's history teacher had assigned a project on civilian contributions to the war effort. Most students wrote about war bonds or victory gardens or scrap metal drives. Sarah Morrison decided to solve what she perceived as a fundamental problem in bomber navigation over occupied Europe. She had read an article about crews getting lost after sustaining damage, about radio equipment failing, about compasses being thrown off by structural damage to the aircraft. She wondered why there was no backup system, no simple visual reference that could help a crew find their way home, even when everything electronic had failed. For 6 weeks, she filled notebooks with sketches and measurements. She calculated angles and distances. She created a system so simple that it seemed almost childish, and yet so practical that it addressed a real gap in existing procedures. Her teacher gave her a C-. The notation on her paper read, "Creative but impractical. Military systems are designed by trained engineers. A visual navigation backup would add unnecessary weight and complexity." Sarah's father, trying to be supportive, suggested she focus on more realistic contributions. Her mother worried that Sarah was setting herself up for disappointment by thinking she could contribute to something as complex as military aviation. Sarah sent her drawings to the War Department anyway. She included a 3-page letter explaining her reasoning, her calculations showing that the system would add less than 12 pounds to an aircraft, and a detailed instruction set that any crew could follow with minimal training. She addressed the envelope with careful precision and mailed it on a Tuesday afternoon in October, using money she had saved from her part-time job at the drugstore. For 3 months she heard nothing. Then, in January of 1944, she received a letter on official War Department stationery. It was brief and formal. "Thank you for your submission. Your idea has been reviewed by technical staff. While innovative, it is not currently being considered for implementation. We appreciate your patriotic spirit." Sarah read the letter twice, folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She told herself she had tried. That was all anyone could do. She went back to her regular schoolwork and her shifts at the drugstore and tried not to think about the dismissal too much. What she did not know, because the letter did not mention it, was that her idea had actually made it to a second-level review. An engineer at Wright Field had looked at her drawings and made a few margin notes. Interesting approach. Simple implementation. Could work in emergency situations. The engineer had passed it along to a colleague who specialized in emergency procedures. That colleague had been intrigued enough to create a more detailed, technical specification. By February, a modified version of Sarah Morrison's idea had been quietly added to the briefing materials for certain bomber groups. It was presented as an experimental backup procedure, something to be aware of but not necessarily to rely upon. Most crews ignored it entirely. Robert Mitchell had not ignored it. He could not explain why he had paid attention to that particular briefing slide, why he had taken notes when everyone around him was talking or sleeping or thinking about the mission that afternoon. Perhaps it was simply luck. Perhaps it was the fact that Mitchell had grown up in rural Montana and understood the value of simple solutions to complex problems. Whatever the reason, he had written down the key points of the system in his flight log, and now, over France with 2 engines failing and a long way from home, those notes were about to save 8 lives. "Harrison," Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the steady drone of the remaining engines. "Do you remember that briefing on visual navigation backup, the one with the improvised system?" Harrison looked at him as though he had started speaking in another language. "The what?" "3 weeks ago," Mitchell continued, "the intelligence officer showed us a diagram, something about using landscape features and compass direction, even without instruments. Simple angle calculations." Harrison shook his head. "I thought that was a joke." "That was supposed to be serious?" Mitchell was already pulling out his flight log, flipping through pages until he found his notes. "It was absolutely serious," he said, "and it might be the only chance we have." The system Sarah Morrison had designed was based on a principle so simple that trained navigators had initially dismissed it as too elementary to be useful. She had noticed that bomber crews, when lost or damaged, often fixated on their instruments, even when those instruments were failing. They trusted their gauges more than their eyes, their calculations more than the evidence passing beneath them. Sarah had wondered what would happen if a crew could navigate using nothing more than a watch, a compass that still pointed north even if nothing else worked, and a basic understanding of geography. Her system required 3 things, all of which Mitchell's crew still possessed. First, an approximate knowledge of their current location. Peterson, despite the chaos, could provide that. They were somewhere south of Reims, northwest of Nancy, heading in a generally westward direction. Second, a watch that kept accurate time. Harrison's wristwatch, a gift from his wife, had survived everything the war had thrown at it so far. Third, a willingness to trust simple mathematics over complicated instruments. Sarah's insight had been that certain landscape features in occupied Europe remained consistent regardless of political boundaries or military movements. Rivers flowed in predictable directions. Mountain ranges could be seen from the air even in poor visibility. Road patterns followed historical trade routes that had existed for centuries. If a crew knew approximately where they were and could identify just 2 or 3 major features, they could calculate a heading home using nothing more than basic geometry. Mitchell explained the system to his crew in short, clear sentences. They would use the remaining light from the moon to identify the Marne River, which should be visible to their south. From the Marne, they would calculate the angle to the Meuse River, which ran roughly north-south along their intended path. By following the Meuse north until they reached the distinctive bend near Sedan, they could then take a direct heading west toward Allied territory. The calculations required only addition and subtraction. The navigation required only the ability to see the ground and maintain a heading. Peterson, the trained navigator, looked skeptical. "Lieutenant, with all respect, we have navigation equipment for a reason. This is basically asking us to navigate like medieval travelers." Mitchell nodded. "That is exactly what I am asking, because medieval travelers made it to their destinations, and right now our navigation equipment is giving us readings that do not match anything I can see out the window." What followed was a masterclass in practical application of theoretical ideas. Peterson, despite his doubts, began identifying features on the ground and comparing them to the predictions Mitchell's system made. The Marne appeared almost exactly where Sarah's geometry said it would be. The road network around Châlons-en-Champagne matched the patterns her system used as reference points. As they followed these features north, tracking their progress with Harrison's watch and making minor corrections based on visible landmarks, the crew began to realize that the impossible was happening. They were navigating a modern bomber using techniques that would have been familiar to a 19th century surveyor. Sullivan, monitoring the radio for any sign of friendly transmissions, called out updates as they progressed. "We just passed over what looks like Sedan," he said. "That distinctive double bend in the river is right where it should be." Chen, from the bombardier position in the nose, confirmed visual sightings that matched Peterson's calculations. "I see the ridgeline the system predicted," he reported. "Bearing is correct. Distance looks right." Ball turret gunner Joseph Martinez, who had been silent for most of the flight, spoke up from his cramped position beneath the aircraft. "I can see the river below us clear as day," he said. "It is like someone drew us a map." Someone did draw them a map. Sarah Morrison, sitting in her history class 2 months later, had no idea that her dismissed project was being tested under the worst possible conditions. She was listening to a lecture about the Constitutional Convention when 8 men she would never meet were proving that her impractical idea actually worked. She was taking notes on federalism when Robert Mitchell was lining up their approach to friendly territory based entirely on her calculations. She was thinking about the test she had next period when Peterson was admitting, grudgingly, that the simple system had been more reliable than any of their damaged instruments. The No. 4 engine finally quit completely as they crossed into Allied-controlled airspace. Mitchell had been coaxing it along for the last 20 minutes, feeding it just enough power to keep them airborne. Now, with safety in sight, it gave up entirely. The aircraft shuddered, dropped 200 feet in a matter of seconds, and then stabilized as Mitchell and Harrison compensated with their remaining engines and every bit of trim they could manage. There was an emergency field ahead, a hastily constructed runway that intelligence had briefed them about. Mitchell had the location memorized because he memorized everything that might keep his crew alive. Now, using the last of their altitude and momentum, they lined up for an approach that was more controlled crash than landing. The wheels touched down hard. The brakes screamed in protest. The aircraft skidded, swayed, and finally rolled to a stop less than 100 feet from the end of the runway. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Harrison started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that broke the tension. "We just navigated 50 miles through enemy territory, using a system designed by someone who has probably never been in an airplane," he said. "I do not even know how to process that." Mitchell unbuckled his harness with hands that shook only slightly. "Process it later," he said. "Right now, let us get out of this aircraft before something else breaks." The debriefing took 4 hours. Mitchell explained the system 3 different times to 3 different officers, each more senior than the last. He showed them his notes from Sarah's diagram. He walked them through each decision point, each calculation, each visual reference they had used. Peterson provided the technical validation, confirming that the simple system had been more accurate than their damaged instruments. By the end of the session, word had spread through the base. The crew that had navigated home using the teenager's idea, the bomber that made it back on geometry, and a wristwatch. Within a week, the story reached command headquarters. Within 2 weeks, someone thought to check who had originally submitted the idea. Sarah Morrison's name appeared in a file that had been marked as interesting, but not essential. An administrative assistant remembered the original letter from Iowa. A colonel with a sense of fairness decided that credit should be given where credit was due. Sarah was sitting in the school library on a Tuesday afternoon in April when the principal came to find her. "There was a telephone call," he said, and his voice had a strange quality that made Sarah worry something had happened to her parents. She followed him to the office, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. The call was from the War Department. The voice on the other end of the line was professional, friendly, and completely unexpected. "Miss Morrison," the voice said, "we want to inform you that your navigation system proposal has been officially adopted as a backup procedure for bomber crews. Your idea saved 8 men over France last month, and we believe it will save more in the future. We would like to recognize your contribution." Sarah, who had received a C- on the original project, sat down in the principal's chair without asking permission. "Could you repeat that, please?" she asked. The recognition came in stages. First, a letter of commendation from the War Department, suitable for framing. Then, a small ceremony at her school where a visiting officer presented her with a certificate and explained to the assembled students how their classmate had contributed to the war effort in a meaningful way. Her history teacher, to his credit, publicly apologized for his initial assessment and changed her grade to an A. Local newspapers picked up the story. Sarah Morrison, teenage girl from Iowa, helped save bomber crew with simple idea. What the newspapers did not fully capture, because it was still happening, was the broader impact. The system Sarah had designed was being incorporated into standard training for bomber crews across multiple air groups. It was not replacing existing navigation systems, but supplementing them, providing a backup option for precisely the kind of emergency Mitchell's crew had faced. Instructors were calling it the Morrison Method and teaching it alongside advanced instrument navigation. The phrase, "if all else fails," navigate like Morrison was becoming shorthand for the kind of practical, simple problem-solving that saved lives. Mitchell wrote Sarah a letter in May. It took him 3 drafts to get the tone right. He wanted to express gratitude without being condescending, to acknowledge her achievement without making it seem like simple luck. The final version was 2 pages long, handwritten and completely sincere. He described the flight in general terms, explained how her system had worked exactly as she had designed it, and thanked her for thinking about problems that no one had asked her to solve. He ended with a line that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "You proved that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. You gave 8 men a chance to go home, and we will never forget that." Sarah kept the letter in her desk drawer, next to the rejection letter from the War Department. She liked the symmetry, the system that almost did not exist, the idea that everyone dismissed, the project that earned a C- and then saved lives. She thought about all the other ideas that probably got rejected, all the other simple solutions that seemed too elementary to take seriously. She wondered how many problems remained unsolved, not because they were impossible, but because the solutions seemed too simple to be real. Harrison, the co-pilot, met Sarah 2 years later at a war bond rally in Chicago. She was 19 by then, studying engineering at the State University on a scholarship that the military had helped arrange. He was 28, no longer flying combat missions, working as an instructor at a training base in Texas. They talked for 20 minutes in the lobby of a hotel, surrounded by the noise of the rally, but somehow creating a quiet space just for their conversation. "You changed how we think about navigation," Harrison told her. "Not just the specific system, but the whole approach. You taught us to trust simple observations as much as complex instruments. That is the real contribution. The system is excellent, but the mindset is revolutionary." Sarah smiled at the characterization. "I'm not sure my high school teachers would agree that anything I did was revolutionary," she said. "They thought I was wasting time on impractical ideas." Harrison shook his head firmly. "The most practical ideas often look impractical at first," he said. "That is how you know they are actually good. If everyone immediately thinks something will work, it probably means someone already thought of it. The ideas that change things are the ones that make people say, 'Wait, could that actually work?'" The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Sarah graduated from university in 1948 with a degree in aerospace engineering, one of only 7 women in her graduating class. She spent 40 years working for companies that designed navigation systems, and she never stopped thinking about the fundamental question her teenage self had asked: how do you help people find their way home when everything else fails? Mitchell stayed in the Air Force after the war, eventually retiring as a colonel. He flew dozens more missions, trained hundreds of pilots, and never forgot the night over France, when a teenager's simple idea had been the difference between survival and capture. He kept Sarah's original diagram, the one from that briefing, in his flight bag for his entire career. When younger pilots asked about it, he told them the story in full, emphasizing the part about the C- grade. Peterson, the navigator who had been skeptical, became a passionate advocate for teaching multiple navigation methods. He wrote a training manual that included detailed instructions on the Morrison method, and he made sure every navigator he trained understood that instruments could fail, but geography remained constant. His manual became standard in training programs and was still being used in updated form decades later. The 8 men of Mitchell's crew all survived the war. They scattered across the country afterward, pursuing civilian lives and careers, but they stayed in touch. Every year on March 15th, they each took a moment to think about the flight over France, the damaged bomber, and the simple system that brought them home. Some of them wrote letters to Sarah on that date, brief notes of continued gratitude. Others made donations to educational charities in her name. All of them told their children and grandchildren about the teenage girl who had seen a problem that no one else was looking at and solved it, with nothing more than careful observation and basic mathematics. The story of Sarah Morrison's idea became something of a legend in military aviation circles, the kind of story that instructors told to make a point about innovation and the value of questioning assumptions. It appeared in textbooks as an example of effective problem solving. It was referenced in strategy documents about encouraging innovation from unexpected sources. The United States Air Force Academy eventually named a scholarship after her, awarded annually to a student who demonstrated creative thinking about practical problems. Sarah herself remained modest about the whole thing. When people asked her about it, in the years after the war, she emphasized the teamwork aspect, the fact that her idea only worked because Mitchell remembered it and had the courage to try something unconventional. She pointed out that dozens of engineers and instructors had refined her original concept, making it more robust and easier to teach. She insisted that the real heroes were the crews who had flown the missions, not the person who had sketched a diagram in a high school notebook. But in private moments, she allowed herself to feel proud. Not proud of the recognition or the awards, but proud of the fact that she had trusted her own thinking even when everyone around her suggested she was wasting her time. Proud that she had mailed that letter to the War Department despite knowing it would probably be ignored. Proud that she had kept working on an idea that her teacher called impractical. The C- grade never bothered her again. She knew what really mattered. 8 men came home. That was the only grade that counted. In the decades that followed, as navigation technology advanced through radio beacons, and then satellite systems, and then computers that could calculate positions to within feet anywhere on Earth, the Morrison method gradually became obsolete as a practical tool, but it remained valuable as a teaching principle, a reminder that complex systems needed simple backups, that technology could fail, and that the human ability to observe and calculate would always be relevant. Modern pilots learned about it not because they would ever need to navigate by river bends and ridgelines, but because it taught them to think about multiple solutions to every problem. The bomber Mitchell flew that night was eventually scrapped for parts. The 4 engines that had kept them in the air, including the 2 that finally quit, were recycled into other aircraft. The airframe was broken down and repurposed. Nothing physical remained of the aircraft that had tested Sarah's idea under the most demanding conditions imaginable, but the knowledge survived. The method survived. The story survived. Sarah Morrison passed away in 2006 at the age of 79. Her obituary in the New York Times mentioned her work in aerospace engineering, her contributions to commercial aviation safety systems, and her volunteer work with programs that encouraged young women to pursue technical careers. But the headline focused on the story that had defined her public identity, teenage girl's wartime idea, saved bomber crew. The article included quotes from Peterson, who was 91 by then and still passionate about teaching navigation. "She changed how we thought about problem solving," he said. "She proved that good ideas do not care about your age or your credentials. They just care about whether you are willing to think carefully and thoroughly about a real problem. Mitchell had died 5 years earlier, but his family shared the letter he had written to Sarah in 1944. It was displayed at a small museum dedicated to bomber crews, placed next to a photograph of Sarah holding her original drawings and a copy of the C- project that had started everything. Visitors to the museum often stopped at that display, reading the letter and looking at the simple sketches, trying to understand how something so basic had proved so valuable. The answer, of course, was in the question itself. Sarah Morrison had not tried to create something complicated. She had tried to create something that would work when everything complicated had already failed. She had understood, perhaps instinctively, that the best backup systems are the ones that strip away complexity and return to fundamental principles. Geography does not change. Rivers keep flowing in the same directions. Mountains remain where they have always been. If you can see those things and calculate angles, you can find your way home. The insight was not that her system was better than advanced instruments. The insight was that it was different, and that difference could be life-saving when instruments failed. In the end, Sarah Morrison's story was not really about navigation systems or bomber crews or even World War II. It was about the value of thinking independently, about trusting your observations even when authorities dismiss them, about the importance of simple solutions in a complex world. It was about a teenage girl who saw a problem that no one had asked her to solve and decided to solve it anyway. It was about 8 men who flew home through the darkness, guided by geometry and faith in an idea that almost never existed. It was about all the other people, in all the other situations, who faced impossible problems and found unexpected solutions by refusing to accept that something could not be done. The C- became an A. The useless idea saved lives. The impractical system worked when everything practical had failed. That is not irony. That is simply the truth about innovation. The ideas that seem most questionable are often the ones that matter most. The solutions that everyone dismisses are sometimes the only solutions that work. And the people who refuse to stop thinking about problems, even when everyone tells them to move on to something more realistic, are the people who change what is possible. 8 men came home because a 17-year-old girl in Iowa decided her idea was worth pursuing, even after everyone said it was not. That is the whole story. That is everything you need to know about why good ideas matter and why you should never, ever assume that someone is too young or too inexperienced to solve a problem that experts have overlooked. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.